Welcome everyone to today's research seminar. I'm Jane Waite and I'll be chairing today's session. And I'm really excited to welcome you to it's our final primary research seminar for 2023. It's our 10th, but we have a real treat in store for you and for me as well. As you know, this series is all around computing education for our youngest of learners from 5 to 11 years old. And we've been exploring how we can support these young learners and their teachers in the teaching and learning of computing. And we are really excited to finish with this brilliant session from Anaclara. So Anaclara is currently doing her PhD in CS at the University of Glasgow with Maria Callier, and she has a background in psychology and cognitive science. And I think it's really exciting to have people from different disciplines coming together to work on in our field. Anaclara, she explores computing education through an interdisciplinary lens, and her research focuses on something that for me, because I was a primary school teacher, so I really do, it resonates with me, and I'm excited to see how this kind of has got research underpinning it. And it's how our youngest of children, they grasp concepts with their hands through hands-on activities and interaction with tangible materials. And Anaclara's seminar tonight, she'll be exploring how the landscape is evolving in terms of early computer science education, from the good old unplugged activities to visual interfaces and lots of different teaching methods, and how that's shaping how our young children engage with computing concepts. And Anaclara will be discussing the implications of grounded cognition theory for the design and structure of computing activities for our youngest. That's to help and support and scaffold their conceptual understanding. So Anaclara, fingers crossed that the tech keeps up with us, and over to you.
So thank you so much for the invite, and it's really an honor to be part of the last seminar of the year. So I'm very excited to be here. I've been reading the chat, and there's quite an international crowd. Very lovely for everyone to join. As Jane said, I'm doing my PhD in computer science education at the University of Glasgow. But you might notice I don't have a Scottish accent because I'm originally from Uruguay. So that's where the accent is going to come from. So as Jane very well said, I decided to do this PhD from an interdisciplinary research perspective. And that was one of the things that really drew me to the topic of computer science education, because it's such an inherently interdisciplinary field, where you really do need everyone's input and everyone's knowledge from computer science, from education. And there's, well, I'm a psychologist, as Jane said, so I consider myself lucky to also have a voice as well. So I think complex problems need complex solutions. So computer science education is one of those fields where we really need to share and talk to each other. And my research, I think, has three main axes, which is early years computing education. So I focus on the learning of really young children, specifically those in kindergarten age, early childhood, and the first years of primary school. Of course, the input from education and the learning sciences, and developmental psychology as well. So those are the three main things informing the research, and I'm really excited to be presenting the framework that we're working on. Let's see. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, what is this big name, grounded cognition? What does it mean? I come from a cognitive science background, so basically we're interested in understanding one very simple yet large question, which is, where does knowledge come from and what is the nature of that knowledge? So grounded cognition is a theory in cognitive science that says that all of the things that we think, all of the things, or mental representation are really grounded in bodily experiences. So those ideas that we have, those mental representations, need to come from somewhere, and they come from the interaction and the co-action with our environment. So it really highlights the role of the body, the role of action, and the role of simulation as well, because there's different, this is like a really complicated theory, and there's really different sides and discussions to it. Some people are more pro like radical embodiment, but grounded cognition in particular was important because it doesn't forget representation as well. So it posits that mental representation is a simulation of the motor actions and the body interactions that we have with our environment. So that's the perspective that I'm going to talk to you about today. As I said, very simple question, but yet very broad. It only took several disciplines and lots of research to understand where does knowledge come from, and as I said, what is the nature of that knowledge. So as you probably know, people who work in education are particularly interested in this question, and it obviously has a ton of from philosophical standpoints and research and discussions surrounding it, from empiricism to innatism, and all of the discussions in between. So it's a very broad question, but it's fundamentally the question that is going to guide your research in the end. Part of the answer to this question that we're going to look at it through the lens of grounded cognition. So as I was mentioning, it highlights the role of the body, and it presents a view of cognition that is systemic in nature. So it presents cognition as a system of interaction between different aspects. And the main discussion here is whether a representation or thoughts are informed by perceptual modalities or not. So grounded cognition is a sort of answer to standard cognitivism, which posits that the brain is a model, in a sense, that we work on memory, and that representation is isolated from the environment. And here the proposal is a little bit different. It is that cognition is formed by these interactions between not only or classical aspects of cognition, so attention, memory, and perception, but also the perceptual modalities or bodily, the things we can do with our body, the affordances that objects have, and all of the environment around it. And you're going to notice part of this situated action cycle that is proposed by Barsalu, which is one of the main proponents of this theory, is that also the goals and the values and the relevance that a task has for us plays a very important role in our understanding of the task. So this is the perspective that we're going to look or research through. And one of our main goals was to use this cognitive lens to understand computer science education in particular. So there's a large body of evidence for grounded cognition. There's evidence about quite a large body of work on the association between gesture, for example, so the role of gestures and understanding. And there's reported associations that by looking at children's and participants' gestures, you can have a sense of their understanding of the theme that they're explaining. Gestures in particular precede words, both ontogenetically and phylogenetically. So in our development, babies start to gesture very early on. And you'll notice, for example, that the pointing gesture is one of the main indicators of social cognition. So gestures are a really important part of the way we structure our thought. And one of the things that this research has in common as well is that the congruency between the action that you're doing and the concept you're targeting seems to be really important. So there's a facilitation between thinking and doing in the action itself. And if there's a congruency there, there might be a way to enhance that learning process. The second body of research that we have is about conceptual learning in particular. So one of the main questions regarding grounded cognition is, okay, so if it's grounded in concrete objects and concrete actions, what happens with the abstract notions? Where do they come from? Where do notions like, I don't know, freedom or algorithm come from? So one of the proposals there is that abstract notions are grounded in metaphors, in embodied metaphors. So there's a large body of literature linking embodied metaphors with abstract notions. There's specifically a lot of research on embodied mathematics, because mathematics as well as computing is a subject, a discipline that deals with a lot of abstractions and a lot of abstract concepts. So there's the field of embodied mathematics. And one of the things there's a lot of research about as well is this thing I was talking about before, that action seems to enhance comprehension. So manipulation of objects seems to help and scaffold children's comprehension of a given task. So our conclusion there would be that physical manipulation seems to be very important for understanding, So based on those notions, we try to use that knowledge towards computing education. So computing education deals with I was mentioned before, deals with the introduction of abstract concepts from quite a fairly young age. So from quite young, children are engaging with abstractions. So basically, abstraction is a relevant process. If you look at, for example, the computational thinking literature, most of the definitions of computational thinking will include abstraction in as one of their main components, and is of course a very important process in computing science. And it is a process that is hard to teach. So there's a general agreement on the value of CS from very young age. There are experiences from the age of 3 years of age. And basically the question would be, well, there are experiences from very young, but we need tools to and pedagogical frameworks to scaffold these abstract concepts for really young children. There's a distinction there between the children are really young, but I still need to teach them something that is quite abstract. So I'm going to just quickly summarize that internationally there is quite a growing trend in the introduction of computing in compulsory curriculums and computational thinking as well. There is a large review in Europe and in the UK as well about the introduction of computational thinking in the curriculums, in the compulsory curriculums. I can speak for the experience of Latin America as well, where many of the states and governments are trying to introduce computing and computational thinking in the mandatory curriculums. Here in Uruguay, for example, it's starting this year, primary teachers who don't have any training in computing, any specific training, are going to start teaching computational thinking and the basis of computing to children from as young as 4 years of age. And we did have a very wide variety of tools, both there are unplugged tools, there are educational robots, there are very lots of virtual settings for programming. We have programming environments targeted and designed for children. So we do have the tools to do it. So my main question is, how do we capitalize what we know of child cognitive development? What I was thinking and explaining before about grounded cognition and how this the representation forms and the concept understanding is achieved to contribute to the field of computer education. So the big question, as I was mentioning, is how do we teach young children fairly abstract computing concepts? And here I'm going to center in three main concepts that we needed to select because, as you know, the field is very large and it's really hard to prioritize what is the most important. But we went with three concepts that are very repeated in the literature and that are the building blocks, in a sense, for later achieving more complex programming. So we chose sequences, repetition, and selection as the three main concepts to target. And as I mentioned, my research is focused on conceptual understanding. And if you think about the notion of a concept in itself and what conceptual understanding is, many authors define concepts as an abstraction of characteristics. For you to form a concept, you need to identify what is common in a group and then create a category in your mind. So conceptual understanding is a student's ability to think about, operate, and explain to others, basically build a mental model of what a category is. So conceptual understanding, in a sense, is in itself a process of abstraction, of selecting those common characteristics and creating a category, a mental category in your mind. So we wanted to focus on children's conceptual understanding. Then we also noticed that there's probably many things that primary teachers and especially early years teachers are already doing to promote this kind of learning. So we wanted to have a systematic way of analyzing these experiences, because many of the activities that early childhood education engages with have to do with manipulation, have to do with concrete objects. This isn't a novel thing, right? We are very used to using concrete materials in the early years. So we wanted to have a record of those experiences that could be considered grounded experiences, but maybe they're not using that specific terminology or they're not using that specific background. So the work that I'm doing is based on the Eiffel model, which is a model proposed by Kalia and Katz. As Jane mentioned, Maria Kalia is my PhD supervisor. The Eiffel model is the enacted, instrumented, formal framework for early learning in computing. And what they have done is created a pedagogical framework based on these notions of grounded cognition to put into practice in the classrooms these principles. So the Eiffel model proposes to organize the instruction prioritizing three very simple things from grounded cognition. So first is the concreteness of the action. So actions are organized according to their level of abstraction, the actions that the children need to take. Of course, the action concept congruency that we were talking before. So the action that you're doing needs to be related to the concept that you are trying to explain. And then it implements object concreteness fading, which basically you transition from more concrete objects and fade it away until you're in a virtual setting, which is something that for many, sometimes we begin from the virtual. So we thought might be a way to scaffold children's transition as well. So there are three types of actions. I was talking before about the action concreteness. There are three types of action in the model. The first is the enacted action. So physical actions happen in the physical world. Children need to move things, manipulate things, move objects around, feel the objects, feel the shape of the objects, and they have a physical, concrete representation in front of them. Then we have the instrumented action, in which the children is given commands through manipulation. So it's going to use pictures or symbols. And a good example of this, for example, would be giving commands to a flow robot, for example. So the children is issuing the commands, but it's not actually manipulating each section of the sequence that he or she is doing. And the last type of action is the formal action. So here it's fully symbolic. Children are dealing with symbols in their mind and in a virtual environment. So it's the highest level of abstraction in the model. And this is, it's important to clarify, I think, that this is a theoretical model, and I'm going to be working, for example, with children that are from the ages of 5 through 7. So I'm not expecting them to reach the formal stage by 7. That would be, we might expect them to work in the enacted phase or the instrumented phase. So then we have 3 types of objects as well. So the model includes different types of objects. Remember, one of the axes was about object concreteness fading. So it's going to work with physical objects, so tangible 3D objects. It's going to work with virtual objects. So that would be, for example, working with a computer or working with a tablet. But remember that these are icons. These are, for example, scratch blocks, for example. And then we have the mental objects, which are mental representations. They are intangible, and you need to manipulate them in your mind. So you could, for example, solve a problem mentally in this type of activity. And here's a graphic representation of what I was just talking about. So if we organize it in 2 axes, we have the action concreteness fading axis, and we have the object concreteness fading axis. So in the action concreteness fading, we're going to have the enacted, the instrumented, and the formal phases. And in the objects, we're going to have the physical, the virtual, and the mental type of object. And then it's just a matter of combining this process. So very young children will theoretically start from the enacted physical and then progressively work their way to a formal mental representation, which would be the highest level of abstraction required. Another thing that this model introduces is the fact that children have different types of roles within the model. So in the first part of the model, in the enacted phase, children are enacting in a sense the activities. So they represent their programs using objects and using themselves as objects. Then we move on to an issuer role. So you give the commands to a robot or to the computer, but this command is in a virtual environment. And then we have the authors. When you're in the formal stage, you're finally constructing your own program, your own code. So you can use the symbols, the symbolic language to represent. So here's a representation of the model with the different roles that the children would play in each stage. So first they would be actors, then there will be issuers, transition into authors, and then fully be authors of their programs. So as I was mentioning, we had the theoretical model, and we wanted to identify if there were any practices that teachers were doing that were congruent with these ideas, with these notions of grounded cognition. And so we basically perform a systematic literature review to identify those practices that might be considered theoretically grounded activities and be in line with this theoretical framework, but might not be necessarily using this specific grounded cognition perspective. So to do that, we used a systematic literature review in which we targeted empirical literature for children 4 to 12-year-olds. As I mentioned, I'm working with 5 through 7-year-olds, but we want to be a little bit broader with this review in order to have a broader set of activities as well. So we were looking at activities that targeted grounded cognition, but also at unplugged activities. Computing activities needed to implement, for example, whole body or physical action, or needed to use any sort of manipulable object. And lastly, we also targeted samples with neurotypical children, and as I said, empirical studies. So our main questions were, what was the activity about? So basically, what grounded approach was implemented? Was it action fading? Was it object concreteness fading? Was it the action concept congruency? We wanted to see as well which theoretical background informed this research. As I mentioned, we looked for unplugged activities as well, in addition to those using grounded cognition. So this wasn't just papers necessarily being based in grounded cognition. It might have been an unplugged experience that used a different theoretical background, or there might have combined backgrounds as well. So we wanted to see how the grounded cognition perspective was reflecting the design of the activity. So basically the link between theory and practice in a sense. And lastly, the outcomes of the papers, whether it was helpful in learning cognitive or motivational outcomes. We also looked at which technological tools were used, but I'm not going to be talking in depth about it because I would be here all day. So our process basically was we conducted a systematic literature review in 4 databases, and our initial search turned to 264 articles, which we then screened and checked for eligibility, and ended up with 45 articles in our systematic literature review. So when we looked at what kind of grounded activities these papers that were targeting grounded cognition or unplugged experiences, the main finding that we have is that most of the activities presented were mixed activities. So it implemented both physical objects, mental objects. Some of them were a combination of robots and then problem solving, for example. But then the most frequent one we had was block-based programming, then flow robots, worksheets, which would be fully unplugged, and then we had programmable objects or toys, construction kits, and then in less frequently board games and spreadsheets. So here's the categories that we used. Whether it was unplugged, we organized whether it was unplugged, physical computing, that would be construction kits, programmable robots and microcontrollers, a virtual category, or a mixed one. Then we looked at which kind of theoretical background was informing this research. So this is probably one of the most surprising findings that we had in this search, because remember, we were targeting specifically papers that were empirical and that were self-proclaimed grounded cognition. So we needed to use the word grounded cognition or embodied cognition, embedded cognition, extended cognition, any sort of the terms related to grounded cognition theory, or unplugged. So that's something that broadened the scope of our search a bit. And the surprising part is that a large majority of papers that we found, so the most frequent finding is that most of them did not have an explicit theoretical background, not only of grounded cognition, an explicit theoretical background of any kind. So that was quite surprising. Then less frequently, but in second place, was constructivism. So the work of, there we group the work of Piaget, Brunner, and Papert, which were the most often mentioned. Then grounded cognition, even though we were doing a specific search. And then, constructionism. Papert was in constructionism. So this is one of the most shocking results in a sense. So as I mentioned, also we wanted to see how this theoretical background informed the activity design. So as you saw in my last graph, most didn't do an explicit theoretical background, but the ones that did, basically they link their theoretical background to the use of concrete objects, and less frequently whole body movement, concreteness fading, and gesture analysis, which was one of the main evidences that I mentioned in the first section. So overwhelmingly, researchers seem to think that using grounded cognition or embodied cognition is the introduction of concrete objects, and we're forgetting a little bit about the introduction of the body and the whole body movement and the fading of concreteness. Well, then we looked a little bit about the outcomes. So I'm going to do a little bit of a disclaimer here, because this is a completely functional characterization of the outcome. So of course, every learning outcome is in a sense a cognitive outcome and a motivational outcome as well. But the distinction we're doing here is whether they did a summative assessment, so that children needed to have a specific knowledge in the assessment, or where they did an assessment where they didn't need to have any specific knowledge. So you're going to find the papers that had a summative assessment in learning, characterized as learning, and cognitive for ones that were measuring cognitive skill but didn't need to have learned any specific knowledge. And then the motivational outcomes, we grouped those papers that did self-assessment in, for example, self-efficacy or enjoyment of the task. So the most frequent ones were learning outcomes, which is a good thing because we were looking for education papers. But then most frequently as well, motivational outcomes. So we're asking enjoyment of the task and self-efficacy, and not so often cognitive tasks. So the findings from this review, which were to have a scope of the state of the art in what was happening in grounded activities in computer education, was that there was a sort of a disconnect between practice and theory. So most of the studies we found were their instruction design, their activities, their proposals were more guided by technological availability. So sadly, the fact that what you have at hand was guiding the research more than the theory behind it. And there was a very strong emphasis, as I mentioned, the role of concrete materials, and not so much on concreteness fading, for example, or gesture analysis or whole body movement. And I should note that, I'm going to go back a little bit, these categories were not exclusive. So you could have a paper theoretically doing all of them, and it would be counted. But still, concrete objects was the most frequent one. So as I said, the main finding from this literature review was that sort of disconnect between theory and practice. So basically, our main conclusion would be like a call to have bridge that gap a little bit. So we need to have practice and experiences and empirical research, which is clearly guided by theory. And that in turn is going to feed theory as well, because we need to test the theories that we have through empirical research. So our next step is to use all of the theory that we have and create a practical experience from it. So as I mentioned, we selected the 3 core concepts that we consider were the most often reported in early computers, and that was sequences, repetition, and selection. And our next step for the iPhone model that I explained is to do an empirical evaluation of the model. So for the empirical evaluation, what we did was refine the model. So we're working with primary teachers in a co-design process of this model, because it doesn't make sense that it's just this thing that comes from academia, and we really want to have teachers involved in the co-design who have feedback, because that is the only way that we're going to make this feasible in a sense. So this feasibility is really important, and we're involving teachers in the co-design of the activities on the model in order for it to be an ecological model and for it to fit in primary classrooms. So we designed a set of activity, and we are doing iterations in this co-design process to improve that set of activities. And I should note that these activities might have been things that early childhood education and primary educators were already doing, but we're also giving it that theoretical background as well and targeting the specific concepts. So the activity itself might not be completely different, and that's a good thing because we want them to fit in the classrooms. So we're currently in that process of iteration. And I wanted to mention before I go to my last slide that for this empirical evaluation, we're having an experimental design. So we are going to have a treatment group and a control group that's going to test the activity. And we're going to do a pre-test where children are going to be tested. We're going to follow them in each of the sessions, interviewing them about, in order to capture their conceptual understanding of sequences, repetition, and selection. And we're using this experimental design and also mixing it with a longitudinal microgenetic design, which is going to allow us to study that conceptual change in a sense. So we want to capture when children are improving their conceptual understanding of each one of these concepts. So part of our object is to have the developmental perspective as well, because sometimes experiments can be a little bit of a box where you don't know what's happening. So we want to really capture the process. That was important for us. And I think I hope I didn't go too quickly. But I'm really excited to get your feedback and discuss. So if you were inclined to get in touch or have any questions, I also have my email here, and I would be very glad to answer questions now after the talk or by email. Feel free to get in touch, and we can discuss the research or computer education in general. That would be great.
So Anaclara, that's brilliant. Can we just give Anaclara a kind of a little clap? That was incredibly interesting. And for me, what's so significant is how few pieces of research there are in this field. And yet across the land, in England, we've been teaching these kinds of lessons for the last 10 years.